Hello and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris. Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Now, Friday, the 24th of November marks exactly 1 year since Anwar Ibrahim was elected as Malaysia's 10th Prime Minister. So what have been the strengths and weaknesses of his premiership so far? And what benchmarks should we use to evaluate his effectiveness within his first year of governance? Joining us on the show now is Anil Netto, who is president of Aliran, or Aliran Kesedaran Negara, better known as Aliran. Anil, thank you so much for being on the show with me today.
Thank you, Melissa.
The first question is, how would you assess Anwar Ibrahim's performance as in his first year as the 10th Prime Minister?
Thank you, Melissa. Well, I think it's been a pretty mixed performance, and maybe the pace of reforms has not been as fast as many would have liked. But I think it's also important to remember that we are in the first year of a 5-year term. So I think we should also give him some slack. But having said that, I think the reforms could have been more effectively implemented, maybe on a shorter time frame.
What's your sense, Anil, of the impatience of the public to see more reforms? Is the public impatient, or do you think many like yourself understand that there's only so much that can be accomplished in the first year?
Yeah, I think the drop in government approval rating to 48% in October from 54% last December is probably due to, well, I mean, 60% of the people's polls said that the country was going the wrong way, and out of that, 60%, 56% said it was due to economic reasons. So I think economy is playing a big role in dampening public sentiment towards this Madani government.
Right. And what about his, so we spoke about Anwar specifically, but what about his cabinet, his unity cabinet? Do you think they are on the same page with Anwar's reformist agenda?
I think it's going to be it has been a big balancing act because we've had people from the old guard now in government, um, UMNO as well, and the former deputy prime minister, leaders from Sabah and Sarawak who are not exactly known for their reform motivations. So it's good. It was always going to be a big ask for Anwar, and so I think that could also help explain the slow pace of reforms.
Can we talk about specifically those reforms specifically? Let's go through some of the reforms that have shown progress, that have been made, that you are satisfied with, and which areas of reform Anwar and his government has fallen short in.
There are not many key reforms that have excited the public, but a few reforms seem to be underway. We've had the end of the mandatory death penalty, and there's some attempts to separate the public prosecutor from the attorney general, but progress seems to be slow, or maybe they've got a lot to deliberate on. And then there's some attempts to look into a political funding act. But I think we have to return to the economy because I was just looking at some statistics earlier, which show that the labor share of national income has dropped from 37+% in 2020 to about 32% now. This was revealed in the Madani economic document. And this is, I think, far short of what we see in the more developed countries. Although globally, labor's share of income has been dropping. But even so, I mean, like in the developed countries, I think it's more like 50 or 40+% or 50+%. So 32% is still is way short of, and I think that's why a lot of people are also struggling. And I think one of the key structural problems also is the high level of national household debt, which is about 89%, which is about on par with Thailand. But if you look at Indonesia and the Philippines, the share of a household debt compared to GDP is well below 20%. So I think people here are also feeling the pinch from high household debt.
What do you think then Anwar needs to focus on as he heads into his second year?
Actually, I mean, of course, political and uh, promises and institutional reforms are important, and I think they should proceed on that. But it's also important to, because 60% say the country is going the wrong way. Majority of them say it's the economic reasons. So I think he has also to focus on the economy, and perhaps one key area to look at is food prices. People are feeling the pinch there. Housing and healthcare. In healthcare, if you look at our spending, public spending on government spending on public healthcare, it's just 2%. Whereas in more developed countries, it's maybe 5%, 6%. So we are spending way too little on public healthcare or hospitals. We need to reform our education system, and find out why so many of the ethnic minorities are staying away from national schools, and try and encourage them to come back. And also need to look at skills improvement, especially for those who move into vocational careers. How can we upgrade their skills? Um, so a lot of things, areas to look at, and public transport is another big issue. Instead of focusing on mega highways, we need to look at public transport. And I think one of the major failures um, in terms of sending the wrong message out was the eviction of farmers in Perak, and also the land reclamation in the south of Penang Island, which has affected the fishermen there. And you're sending the wrong message about food security. Um, Although in Para they say they want to get business companies to move into agriculture, but I think it's also important to support our small and independent farmers and fisher folk.
I have to ask you, do you think that for all the good that this government has done in the past year, has that been communicated effectively enough so that people know what it is that they've been doing and may be hopeful for the trajectory of the coming years?
I think communication is important. Communication is also important, but I think more important is for people to actually feel the effects of the uh, policies that have been introduced. So if you try to tell them that you've done this, but they don't feel any improvement, then it's not going to help. So really, one area which perhaps which would make a lot of difference, especially now that Malaysia is going to become an aging society and is already an aging society, um, is the idea of a universal pension scheme. Uh, and this would be very popular if the government could implement it. But of course they'll say we don't have enough funds to do this, and we don't have enough funds to for hospitals and schools. But actually, one way to there's several ways where they can increase the funding for these kind of welfare policies, and that is through cutting back on leaks and corruption in government spending. We know lots of money has been wasted on corruption and rent seeking and that kind of thing. So estimates have put it at about 20 to 30 billion lost every year. So that's a huge chunk of money which could be saved. And then also we can think of slow progressive improvements in our taxation system, where the introduction of wealth taxes and sales taxes on luxury items, all these could help to raise more revenue for the government. Inheritance taxes on the super wealthy, um, so these kinds of things would help to raise funds for these kinds of welfare policies, especially the universal pension scheme. Because if you look at the EPF with savings for
Yes,
among people, not enough.
that's right.
The last maybe for some people it could be just enough for a year or maybe less after retirement. No?
Anil, thank you so much for joining me on the show today. That was Anil Netto from Aliran. We're going to take a quick break here and consider this. We will be back with more. Stay tuned. Hi, welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris. Let's continue our discussion about Anwar Ibrahim's performance as Malaysia's 10th Prime Minister, this as he clocks his first anniversary in office. Political analyst Dr. Bridget Welsh joins us now. She's an honorary research associate at the University of Nottingham, Malaysia's Asia Research Institute. Bridget, thanks for joining me on the show today. Let's jump right in. How would you describe Anwar's stewardship of the country in the past 1 year?
Well, if there's one word to describe it, I would say that it's been mixed. I think on the positive side, what he's done is we can see that there is greater political stability after a period of significant political uncertainty for Malaysia. But the real challenge is that, Anwar's term has not had clear direction. And there's been a lot of things that have been a lot of distractions. And so it's still very much in the early stages of him defining his prime ministership and the direction for the country.
So the last time we spoke, Bridget, was to mark his 100 days in office. That was one of the times we spoke. And that was, of course, before the state elections. Now that we know the results of the state elections, how would you gauge his support amongst his Malay supporters and his efforts to gain ground within his Malay supporters? Has that jeopardized his non-Malay voter base?
So my analysis of the voting in the state elections indicates three different patterns. And I've looked pretty much at three out of the 6 states, which are most of those on the West Coast, Negeri Sembilan, Penang, and Selangor. And what is interesting is that Pakatan Harapan support stayed roughly the same as it did in 2022 in the GE15. So among young people, among its political base, with the exception of losing support among Indians. I would say that its Malay vote also stayed the same, which was very low at around 11 to 13%, which indicates that it hasn't declined further, but it also hasn't increased from a perspective of electoral performance. What we did see, however, in the state elections is that UMNO continued to lose more support in its seats, especially among younger voters. So what I would say is, from an electoral perspective, the state election shows that the Anwar government hasn't really gained any traction. It is beginning to lose traction. And I think the real challenge is that it's now very dependent on Chinese support, particularly in the more urban areas, and it doesn't have a very strong Malay base. And I think this is something that the government has wrestled with, and this is one of the things that's defined Anwar's term in office so far, is that he's desperately searching for Malay support, and therefore you can see he's playing an Islamization card, and he's doing this very risky, so in such a way that it undermines the support of non-Malays because they see very little difference between him and PAS compared to where he came in from office. So some of the policies he's articulating really, raises the question for many voters is, how different is he if in fact he's articulating these types of messages? The second bigger issue is that the challenge is the economy. And what we can see is that in the beginning part of his term, there were some indications of economic reform, some challenges of the monopolies, but we've had 2 budgets, which have been what I would call tinkering budgets. They have made some small changes here and there, but they haven't defined his priorities. And keep in mind, Anwar Ibrahim is the finance minister, although it's not so clear because he's making so many trips abroad. We're not so sure, what he's doing in terms of his direction. But the fact is that we see is a situation of, where is the direction and policy direction for the economy is really a challenge.
But Bridget, so I have to ask you then, what were your expectations for Anwar and for his unity government in the first year? Realistically, what could he have accomplished in his first year that would get him an A+ on the report card?
I think that you need to have a clear set of focus on domestic issues. And I think this is the first element. I think that there's a sense that he's focusing on too many things at once, as opposed to kind of having a direction. The economic programs, there have been two major plans, an industrial plan as well as a energy program as on renewable energy, as well as a midterm review. These issues haven't really laid out kind of concrete proposals or directions. And I think, he's trying to build confidence in the economy, but the more he keeps trying, the more the sense that there's that he's doing too many things and not focused. So I think from a perspective of economic focus, this would be very important. I think the third thing is that, he came in as a reformer, and when you have issues that really attack the credibility of reform, such as, charges being dropped for political allies, these actually really affect your credibility. So therefore, you need to have other areas where you build credibility. And I think, it's very difficult for many people to point to concrete issues of what is Anwar's government, what he's done. Now, this is not to say that there haven't been a very important landmark legislation during this time. We've seen the death penalty passed, decriminalization of suicide. We've seen, housing, housewives getting social security benefits. We've seen the legalization of trade unions. These are really important initiatives, but many of them began before Anwar's government started. In fact, ironically, in the Mahathir government, many of them were pushed. Even child protection, I would add to that list. But the other measures he said that have tried to define him, such as the climate change bill, or such as issues associated with data protection, for example, these have not gained traction. And so therefore, it's hard to point to these concrete deliverables. So what we see is that it's definitely a passing grade, and even I would say above passing. But the fact is that, Anwar Ibrahim had a lot of expectations, and there's a sense that people were looking for him for statesman leadership and looking for direction. This is an opportunity, and what people haven't seen yet is that. And so you can see growing ambivalence even from August to November among, say, Chinese voters and business people in the economy. You also see, concerns, why is all this conversation happening about things that aren't in Malaysia as opposed to in Malaysia? And so these issues have really kind of ratcheted down expectations, but also kind of taken away a lot of the enthusiasm.
Right. You alluded to his numerous international visits. I wanted to touch on that. So his detractors have argued that his frequent visibility at international events has diverted attention from domestic policy programs. Can I ask you whether there's any merit in that claim, and whether that has been to Anwar's, whether that's detracted from Anwar's support at home?
So the real challenge is that many people who criticize him talk about this as being a government all about Anwar, as opposed to being a government about Malaysia in terms of the policies and initiatives. And so the foreign trips are part of that, right? Why do you go spend so much time outside when, Malaysia hasn't yet recovered from COVID? It is dealing with many serious challenges. This is an opportunity, for the government to begin to sort of lay out that. The sense is that, his team, his cabinet, has been in need of a cabinet reshuffle for many months, and has yet had one. And they're seen to be his people as opposed to a government made up of the different stronger elements of the coalition that can bring new ideas and push. So there's a lot of unevenness, and that unevenness continues to play itself out with little episodes happening here or there, which continues to focus the point that there are too many distractions, and there comes a point where you can talk as much, but now people are saying, wait a minute, we've given you a year, what are you actually delivering to us?
coming to that point on the cabinet, there were so many rumors of a cabinet reshuffle. We also have one empty cabinet seat that has yet to be filled. Why has it been so difficult for Anwar to fill this seat or to look at his cabinet and see whether there is a need for a reshuffle?
I think the question of why has to ask Anwar Ibrahim from a perspective of the choices, especially, having domestic trade, a ministry that is so pivotal for the issues of cost of living in Malaysia go empty for so long, and then make a comment such as that there's not a suitable candidate really is quite, seen as somewhat disrespectful to some of his coalition partners and to many people who are elected into the government and the different coalitions. There are many candidates that could potentially fill that position. I think that, there is broadly this perception that often when opposition politicians come into government, they continue to act the way they did in opposition. And so what happens here for Anwar Ibrahim is that he's acting as if he's very insecure. He has two-thirds of the parliament. He has, he has passed one of the most important steps in terms of an election, and he has yet to be willing to make a cabinet reshuffle because he's worried that this is going to impact his coalition actors and supporters. Yes, there's questions here, but there's obviously an ability to begin to find better people to strengthen the government. This is a one-year opportunity to make change, but you can also add into the mix that we will see a new king next year. So this may be a factor shaping the timing of a cabinet reshuffle, but as well as the coalition partners and trying to deal with that. There is this sense that he keeps portraying himself as insecure by trying to say, hey, please support me in that context. But the fact is that, if he continues that, he continues to lose the opportunities and the time that he does have.
So playing on the kind of insecure card, Bridget, do you think that Anwar should not have accepted the support of the 4 Bersatu MPs out of his own reformist principles? Should he have been against welcoming opposition MPs' support because it could be perceived as him going against his own, his own reform agenda?
So I think the big problem with Anwar's government has been that they've been using the issue of constituency allocations for political pressure on opposition politicians. And this was what happened during the UMNO period. This is what the opposition, Pakatan Harapan, when they were opposition, fought against and signed an MOU with Ismail Sabri, the former prime minister, in order to be able to remove. And what happens is that this is not just about political pressure on oppositions. It's about a discrimination against voters who voted for the opposition. And I think this is a very unfair allocation. So the drivers of many of the Bersatu MPs that have moved, there are 2. Number one, there's clearly a split in the party and dynamics are taking place and pressures. So we know those things are very clear. But the second is that they are, they have to deal with the fact that they have constituency demands, often in constituencies that have high level of poverty, but also a pattern of patronage. So there's an expectation of having deliverables. There's a question of getting support and getting support. You can get support on policy issues. In fact, many bills perhaps should be considered on the basis of those bills and the policy initiatives. And in fact, this is something that would be a very welcome change because of in a more democratic process, people cross party lines all the time. But to couch this as, we're supporting the Anwar government is also to kind of feed the instability and to undermine the anti-hopping law, undermine the basis of the issues that have helped to provide the security for Anwar's government. And ultimately, when you start to mess with something, then it starts to get messy.
Bridget, thank you so much for your time. That was political analyst Dr. Bridget Welsh wrapping up this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris signing off for the evening. Thank you so much for watching and good night.